In the quiet halls of Dallas senior homes, a smiling caregiver moved unnoticed, until peaceful deaths began to hide a sinister truth. Behind every gentle knock was a silent killer with a pillow in his hand. This is the chilling story of trust, betrayal, and the pillowcase murders. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in the sunlit corridors of senior living communities across Dallas and its surrounding suburbs. The women who lived there were mothers, grandmothers, and teachers, survivors of wars, marriages, and the passing of time. They spent their days sharing coffee in communal kitchens, gossiping over bridge games, or waiting for family visits that didn't come as often as they used to. The staff knew them all by name. They were gentle souls who seemed safe within the secured walls of their retirement homes, places built on trust, where danger wasn't supposed to exist. But between 2016 and 2018, that sense of safety began to fracture. Elderly women started dying in their beds, their bodies discovered peacefully under quilts or in recliners. The deaths were marked as natural causes, tragic but expected given their ages. Families mourned quietly, accepting the explanations they were given. No one suspected that beneath these ordinary passings lay the work of a man who moved through these communities like a shadow. His name was Billy Kipkerer, a tall, soft-spoken man with a polite smile and a Kenyan accent. To most who encountered him, he was harmless. A caregiver, a maintenance worker, sometimes a delivery man dropping off small items. He blended into the background of the elderly world, where faces came and went with staff rotations. But behind the mask of service, Kemmermere carried something darker. Born in Kenya in 1972, he had once lived a modest life, but after moving to the United States in the early 2000s, he struggled to find stability. He worked in home health care, a profession that gave him access to people's most private spaces and the habits of the vulnerable. To his employers, he appeared calm and dependable. Yet, those who watched him closely said there was something unsettling about his quiet confidence, a calculating patience behind his kind eyes. In these senior communities, doors were left unlocked for convenience, and the residents, frail and trusting, often welcomed anyone who appeared to be from management. Kemmermere used this to his advantage. He would dress neatly, carry small tools or papers, and knock on doors under the pretense of checking smoke alarms or delivering maintenance updates. Once inside, his manner was disarming. Gentle questions, polite greetings, a calm voice. Then, at the right moment, he would strike. Using a pillow, sometimes taken from the victim's own bed, he would smother them with silent precision. Took only seconds. When it was done, he'd take jewelry, rings, or small boxes, valuables that could be pawned or sold online. The scene he left behind was always the same. An elderly woman lying peacefully, no signs of struggle, no broken locks, no noise. Among the earliest to die was Mary Brooks, 87 years old, a widow who had lived alone in Richardson. Her daughter had visited her just days before, noticing how cheerful her mother seemed. When Mary was later found lifeless, the coroner noted no bruising or injuries. The death certificate read, "Natural causes." Another woman, Leah Corkin, 83, in Plano, was discovered the same way. Lifeless but undisturbed, her wedding ring gone. To outsiders, these were coincidences, the quiet rhythm of mortality among the elderly. But as the months passed, whispers grew. Jewelry was missing. Rings disappeared. Boxes of family heirlooms couldn't be found after funerals. Still, no one suspected murder. For Kemmermere, the ease of his work was part of its intoxication. Each visit seemed effortless. A brief knock, a few soft words, and then silence. He would move from one community to another, sometimes the same day, driving his silver Nissan Altima between Dallas, Plano, and Frisco. The car became his mobile workshop, filled with small tools, cleaning cloths, and envelopes of jewelry. To anyone passing him on the road, he looked like an ordinary man finishing a shift. But for police, who at the time had no clue he existed, a pattern was quietly forming, one that wouldn't be recognized until far too late. What made these murders particularly sinister was the way they slipped through the system. In Texas, senior deaths rarely triggered autopsies unless there were obvious signs of foul play. A peaceful body, a locked door, and no external injuries usually meant paperwork, not investigation. Kemmermere understood this perfectly. He knew that no one would question why an 85-year-old woman died in her sleep. And as long as he left no bruises and took nothing too large or traceable, the illusion of natural death would protect him. Meanwhile, in those same communities, staff turnover was high and memory short. New workers came in, unaware that the same kind, smiling man had visited multiple facilities over the past months. Even residents began to recognize him, but not with fear. They thought of him as the helpful worker who fixed things or brought deliveries. His calmness disarmed suspicion. Behind closed doors, however, he grew bolder. In late 2017, he began visiting private homes of older women who lived independently but were still part of senior networks. He'd find them through directories, old patient lists, or casual referrals from his previous caregiving jobs. His method never changed. Soft entry, quick violence, quiet exit. He moved with such precision that even he began to believe he was untouchable. But killers who operate in silence often leave one sound they can't control, the sound of survival. In March 2018, in a modest apartment complex in Plano, Mary Bartle, a 91-year-old retired teacher, opened her door to a stranger. He said he was delivering jewelry from a friend. His voice was kind, steady, reassuring. She let him in. Within minutes, he shoved her back onto the bed and pressed a pillow over her face. The world went black. When she awoke, the man was gone, and so was her jewelry box. Trembling, she called for help. Bartle survived by chance. The pillow had slipped just enough for her to breathe. Her survival would unravel a secret that had taken years to surface. When detectives arrived, Bartle described her attacker clearly. Tall, dark-skinned, neatly dressed, driving a silver Nissan. The description alone wouldn't have been enough, but the detail of the car stood out. Investigators began checking surveillance footage from nearby parking lots and door cameras. Days later, a license plate match emerged. Billy Kemmermere, a name already faintly known to local police for minor incidents but nothing violent. They began surveillance. On a warm morning, plainclothes officers followed Kemmermere as he drove through Dallas. He stopped near a trash bin outside his apartment complex and threw away something small, a jewelry box. When police retrieved it, inside were documents belonging to Lou T. Harris, an 81-year-old woman found dead in her Dallas home that very day. Her cause of death had been listed as unexplained. The box was the link investigators needed. Kemmermere was arrested hours later. When they searched his apartment, the true horror unfolded. Drawers filled with jewelry, dozens of keys, small trinkets, and personal items belonging to elderly women were neatly organized and stored away like trophies. Many pieces matched reports from families who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances. Each item told a story: a ring from a 90th birthday, a necklace gifted on a wedding day, a bracelet passed down through generations. They were fragments of lives that had been quietly extinguished under the weight of a pillow. As police pieced together the evidence, the scope became staggering. This wasn't just one or two murders. It was a serial pattern spanning years, communities, and counties. Elderly women across Dallas, Richardson, Plano, and Frisco had died under nearly identical circumstances. Their deaths had been signed off by doctors, their funerals held, their apartments re-rented. All while the man responsible lived freely, driving from one community to the next. The arrest of Billy Kemmermere in March 2018 sent a shockwave through Dallas law enforcement. Detectives who had spent years seeing elderly deaths as part of the natural rhythm of aging now faced the horrifying possibility that dozens of those deaths were murders in disguise. The jewelry box found in the trash bin outside Kemmermere's apartment became the first thread that, when pulled, unraveled a web of death that spanned senior living facilities across multiple counties. Inside the Plano Police Department, a special task force was formed. A small team of investigators, analysts, and forensic specialists who began combing through years of death certificates, crime scene photos, and missing property reports. What they found was chilling. The same pattern appeared over and over again. Elderly women living alone, discovered dead in their beds or recliners. No forced entry, no bruises, Nothing missing except small valuables. Rings, necklaces, heirloom brooches. Each case on its own was unremarkable, easily dismissed as natural. But together, they formed a timeline of precision and repetition. Detectives began pinning photos on a wall. Faces of women, dates of death, addresses. Dallas, Plano, Richardson, Frisco. Slowly, the picture came into focus. One man had been moving quietly among them for years. When police searched Kemermir's apartment in Dallas, they uncovered evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Dozens of jewelry boxes were stacked in drawers, each containing trinkets and documents belonging to women whose deaths had been previously ruled natural. There were driver's licenses, old insurance cards, prescription notes, and photographs. It was as if he had kept souvenirs from each of his victims, small reminders of the lives he had taken. Detectives cataloged everything, photographing and labeling every piece. Family members were brought in to identify the items. Many wept as they recognized jewelry once worn by mothers and grandmothers. One woman clutched a silver ring, whispering that her mother never took it off, not until she died. Meanwhile, Billy Kemermir sat in an interrogation room, calm and expressionless. Detectives described him as eerily composed, answering questions with short, polite sentences. He denied everything. He claimed the jewelry was purchased secondhand. The documents were discarded mail, the accusations baseless. He didn't flinch when shown photos of his victims. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, as though detached from the weight of what he was hearing. To investigators, this calm was not innocence. It was control, the same composure he had used to gain the trust of his victims. As the investigation widened, the number of potential victims grew. 18 names were officially linked to Kemermir, but detectives suspected there could be more, perhaps dozens whose cases had gone unnoticed. The victims ranged from their late 70s to early 90s, all women, mostly living in independent or assisted living communities. Their deaths spanned from 2016 to 2018, but later reviews suggested the killings might have started even earlier. Forensic experts re-examined autopsy reports, looking for subtle signs of smothering, broken capillaries in the eyes, faint bruising under the chin, traces that had once been ignored. For the families, the realization was unbearable. Many had lived with guilt, thinking they had failed to notice their loved ones' declining health. Now, they learned that these deaths were not natural but deliberate. At vigils and press conferences, children and grandchildren of the victims stood together, holding framed photos. They spoke of mothers who baked cookies for church events, grandmothers who still wrote letters in elegant cursive, women who had lived through wars and hardships only to be taken by a man pretending to care for them. Their anger was quiet but immense. They demanded answers. How had so many deaths been missed? Why had no one seen the pattern sooner? Within the police department, those questions stung. Some detectives admitted privately that the system had failed these women. In most of the cases, the signs were subtle, and without forced entry or visible trauma, homicide had never been considered. The medical examiners had done what protocol dictated, signed off on natural causes. But Kemermir had exploited that trust, mastering the art of leaving no trace. His murders were surgical in their simplicity, each one taking place in minutes, the evidence wiped away with a pillowcase. As prosecutors prepared the case, they faced another challenge, proving beyond doubt that Kemermir was responsible for all the deaths. Physical evidence was limited. No DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses. The key link in the chain was Mary Bartle, the lone survivor whose testimony provided the foundation of the entire case. Bartle described every detail, the man's calm voice, his method, the pillow pressed over her face. Her words painted the first clear picture of how he operated. Investigators used her account to re-examine other deaths, comparing timelines and known sightings of Kemermir at the communities. The similarities were undeniable. The case of Lou T. Harris, the 81-year-old found dead the day of Kemermir's arrest, became the prosecution's strongest evidence. The jewelry box linked directly to her, found in Kemermir's trash bin, was irrefutable. Her death, once unexplained, was now the cornerstone of a serial murder investigation. When the charges were filed, the list of victims stunned the public. 18 counts of capital murder, each representing a woman who had once trusted a stranger at her door. As news spread, media outlets descended on Dallas. Headlines called him the pillowcase killer or the caregiver of death. Television crews camped outside court buildings, capturing every movement of the case. Residents in senior communities became fearful. Doors once left unlocked now secured with chains and alarms. For the elderly across Texas, the fear was not just of death, but of betrayal, that someone who smiled at them could be the one who took their last breath. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Family members sat in silence, clutching photos of their loved ones. The prosecutors detailed each killing, showing images of jewelry, death certificates, and surveillance footage. They described how Kemmermeer used his caregiving background to identify targets, often selecting women who lived alone and had no nearby relatives. His method was always the same: a gentle knock, a polite entry, a swift and silent smothering. Then he would slip away, pocketing what he could carry, leaving behind nothing but stillness. Kemmermeer's defense maintained his innocence, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial, that the jewelry could have come from other sources, that the medical examiner's findings were not conclusive. But the cumulative weight of the details, the pattern, the timing, the stolen items became too much to ignore. Jurors listened as forensic experts explained how smothering can leave minimal marks, especially on fragile elderly victims. The testimony was clinical, but the implication was devastating. Outside the courthouse, the families spoke to reporters, their grief mixed with quiet resolve. They wanted the world to remember their mothers not as numbers, but as women who had lived full lives, women whose trust was their undoing. One daughter described her mother's kindness, saying she would have offered the man a glass of water before realizing what danger she was in. Another said she still dreamed of her mother's last moments, wondering if she had time to feel fear. As the trial continued, the courtroom became a place of confrontation between the image of a polite caregiver and the reality of a serial predator. Prosecutors called him methodical, emotionless, a man who saw vulnerability as opportunity. They spoke of his calm demeanor, his lack of remorse, and the trophies he kept as evidence of control. Each word built the image of a killer who thrived on silence, a man who murdered without blood, without noise, and for years without suspicion. The case was no longer just about one man's crimes. It had become an indictment of a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Investigators, prosecutors, and families alike understood that what they were witnessing was not just justice being served, but a reckoning for years of overlooked deaths. As the closing arguments drew near, one truth lingered in the air, that behind every smiling face in those senior living photos was a life taken too soon, and behind each pillow pressed in the quiet of the night stood the same calm, unshaken man, Billy Kemmermeer. When the courtroom doors opened for the final phase of the trial, the air was heavy with the weight of years of pain. Families of the victims filled the seats, clutching framed photos, rosaries, and handwritten notes. They came not just for justice but for closure, an ending to the nightmare that had shadowed them since the day they learned their mothers and grandmothers were murdered, not taken by time. The prosecution began its closing argument with a photograph, not of Billy Kemmermeer, but of one of his victims, Lou T. Harris, smiling in her garden. The image of an elderly woman surrounded by flowers contrasted sharply with the description that followed. How her life ended silently under a pillow, her jewelry stripped away, her home left untouched except for the absence of her warmth. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man who had turned kindness into a weapon. They spoke about the calm precision with which he moved through senior communities, his ability to wear a mask of trust while preying on those least able to defend themselves. They described him as a predator of opportunity, a man who found his victims through their vulnerabilities, age, loneliness, and faith in others. The evidence was overwhelming. The stolen jewelry, the survivor's testimony, the matching timelines. It wasn't one death or two, but a pattern so consistent that it could no longer be coincidence. When Billy Kemmermeer rose to hear his sentence, his face remained still, unreadable. He showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read: guilty of capital murder. The families, who had held their breath for days, finally exhaled in tears and quiet sobs. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There would be no more appeals, no more chances to walk free. The man who had walked through unlocked doors and ended so many lives would spend the rest of his own behind them. But even as justice was served in a legal sense, the emotional reckoning for the community was far from over. Across Dallas, Plano, and Frisco, senior living facilities reviewed their policies, installing new cameras, requiring stricter background checks, and reevaluating how caregivers and maintenance workers gained access. For families who had lost loved ones, these changes came too late. At vigils held in church halls and retirement home courtyards, candles flickered beside framed photos. Smiling faces of women who had lived through the Depression, raised families, and contributed to their communities. Each name was read aloud, followed by silence. The gatherings weren't just memorials. They were statements of resilience, proof that their stories would not be forgotten. Detectives who had worked on the case struggled with the aftermath too. Many admitted it was one of the most haunting investigations of their careers. They had walked through the apartments where the crimes occurred, tidy spaces with framed family photos, unfinished crossword puzzles, and teacups left on counters. There were no signs of struggle, only the eerie calm that followed the violence. One investigator said later that it wasn't the crime scenes that stayed with him, but the trust those women had shown, how they had let the killer in with a smile. It reminded him of his own grandmother, who lived alone and would have done the same. The story of the pillowcase murders soon reached national attention. News outlets aired documentaries. Podcasts examined the failures that allowed the killings to go unnoticed for so long, and public outrage grew over how easily the deaths of elderly women had been dismissed as natural. Forensic experts and medical examiners across the country revisited old cases, realizing that the same blind spots could exist anywhere. The case became a turning point in how elder deaths were investigated, forcing a shift in policy and awareness. No longer would age alone explain a sudden death without proper scrutiny. Meanwhile, behind prison walls, Billy Kemmermeer lived in silence. He maintained his innocence until the end, giving no confession, no explanation, no sign of remorse. Inmates described him as quiet, detached, someone who kept to himself. To the families of his victims, that silence was perhaps the cruelest part, the absence of answers, the refusal to acknowledge what he had done. But justice, in their eyes, had still been served. Then, in September 2023, news broke once again. Billy Kemmermeer was found dead in his cell, killed by another inmate. For some, it felt like a grim but fitting end. For others, it reopened old wounds, robbing them of the chance to ever hear him explain why he did it. Reporters swarmed the story again, revisiting the timeline of his crimes, the system's failures, and the enduring grief of the families. One daughter of a victim told a local station, "It doesn't bring my mother back, but maybe it brings an ending. Maybe now he can't hurt anyone else." In the years that followed, the pillowcase murders became a dark chapter in Texas history, not just because of the number of victims, but because of what the case revealed about human vulnerability and institutional blindness. The elderly, often forgotten in society, had been invisible victims in plain sight. Their trust, their politeness, their quiet acceptance of strangers had become their undoing. The story was a reminder that evil often hides not behind masks of rage or violence, but behind calm smiles and helping hands. The women he killed were not just statistics. Mary Brooks, 87, a lover of gardening and crossword puzzles. Leah Corkin, 83, known for her sharp wit and love of cooking. Lou T. Harris, 81, a gentle soul who loved to feed birds in her backyard. And Mary Bartle, 91, the survivor whose courage exposed the truth. Each represented a generation of women who had built families and communities, only to be betrayed by someone who appeared to care. Their lives became the silent testimony that ultimately condemned him. In a documentary aired a year later, footage of these women's homes, photos, and interviews with their families were interwoven with the haunting narration of how easily trust can be weaponized. A former detective's voice summarized it best. He didn't need a gun or a knife. He only needed the one thing people are least prepared to defend, their trust. The screen faded to black, showing the names of all the confirmed victims, followed by the words, "and many more suspected." Today, the legacy of the pillowcase murders lingers in every senior home that locks its doors more carefully, in every family that checks in a little more often on their elders. It is a legacy built on tragedy but also on awareness. Through the horror of what Kemmermere did, systems changed, and complacency was challenged. His crimes forced a state and a nation to look closely at how society treats its aging population, how easily they can be overlooked, and how fragile the concept of safety truly is. As the story concludes, the image that remains is not of the killer but of the women he thought would be forgotten. Faces framed in soft light, smiling as they once did, their memory stronger than the man who took them. Their deaths shook the silence of complacency, turning grief into change. And though the killer died behind bars, the voices of his victims continue to echo through courtrooms, newsrooms, and the homes of those who still light candles in their honor. The pillowcase murders will always stand as one of America's most haunting reminders that evil often comes quietly, with a knock at the door, a soft voice, and a promise to help, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters were the kindest faces. In a quiet English village, a daughter's chilling secret lay hidden for 4 years, her parents buried inside the home they once shared. What drove Virginia McCullough to poison, kill, and live among their remains? This is the disturbing story of deceit, denial, and a family's unthinkable betrayal. In the heart of Great Bad Dow, a tranquil village nestled on the outskirts of Chelmsford, Essex, life moved with the slow rhythm of routine and familiarity. Rows of well-tended gardens, quiet streets, and neighbors who knew each other by name formed the comforting backdrop of this suburban haven. Among the village's most respected residents were John and Lois McCullough, a couple whose gentle manners and kindness had made them beloved figures in the community. They were the embodiment of decency. John, a retired engineer with a methodical mind and a calm presence, and Lois, a former social worker whose compassion seemed to radiate in every conversation. Their lives were simple, quiet, and rooted in the comfort of each other's company. But behind the closed doors of their modest home on Pump Hill, an unsettling darkness was taking shape, one that would eventually tear apart the peaceful image of Great Bad Dow forever. Their youngest daughter, Virginia McCullough, had returned to live with them sometime before 2019. To outsiders, it seemed like a family simply supporting one of their own through a rough patch. But for those who looked closer, Virginia's return marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. She was in her mid-30s, once full of potential but now struggling with instability, unemployment, and strained relationships. Friends from her earlier life remembered her as bright yet troubled, someone who could never quite find her place in the world. Financial troubles followed her, as did a long battle with mental health difficulties that often left her withdrawn, unpredictable, and resentful of those around her. Her parents, ever patient and supportive, provided her with the security she lacked elsewhere. But as the months went by, even their patience began to wear thin. Life inside the McCullough home became tense. Neighbors would sometimes hear muffled arguments through the walls, or notice Virginia looking distant and irritable during errands. Lois, known for her warmth, grew quieter, less visible in the community she once engaged with so freely. John, though still polite and calm, seemed more tired, his steady nature now masking frustration and helplessness. Virginia's dependence on her parents deepened as her own life stagnated. She rarely left the house except for short walks or quick shopping trips, and when she did, she often avoided eye contact, as though hiding a secret she hadn't yet defined. To her, the walls of that house became both a refuge and a prison, holding within them her growing resentment toward the very people who were keeping her afloat. By the spring of 2019, the tension had reached its silent breaking point. Virginia, overwhelmed by feelings of failure and bitterness, began to imagine a life where her problems could be erased. A fantasy where her dependence on her parents could end not through change, but through their absence. What began as frustration evolved into delusion, then into planning. In her increasingly isolated state, She convinced herself that their deaths could solve everything: the emotional suffocation, the financial strain, and the constant reminder of her own inadequacy. In June 2019, Virginia made her move. She began by tampering with her parents' prescription medications, using them to create a fatal mix. To her, poisoning must have seemed the least violent way: quiet, controlled, and easy to disguise as natural causes. She planned it meticulously, waiting for the right moment when both parents would be home together, unaware of her intentions. That evening, she prepared their food or drinks as usual, perhaps even engaging in normal conversation, masking the sinister act she was about to commit. Hours later, John McCullough began showing signs of distress. He grew dizzy, weak, and unresponsive, symptoms that must have terrified Lois, who had no idea her daughter was behind it. Within a short span of time, John was dead. Virginia's plan had worked, at least in part. But when Lois survived the initial poisoning, panic set in. Her mother was still alive, disoriented but conscious enough to sense that something was terribly wrong. It was in that moment that the facade shattered completely. The daughter who had once been loved and protected by her parents crossed into unthinkable territory. Consumed by fear of discovery and a twisted sense of finality, Virginia turned to violence. The details of what happened next remain only partly known, pieced together from forensic evidence and her later confessions. What is certain is that Lois's death was brutal. Virginia struck her repeatedly. Reports would later suggest blunt and sharp force injuries, indicating that she both beat and stabbed her mother in a desperate frenzy. The quiet home on Pump Hill became a scene of unimaginable horror, its walls witnessing the violent end of two lives that had been built on love and devotion. When it was over, silence returned, but it was a hollow, chilling silence. The air was heavy with death, and for a moment, Virginia stood alone amid the wreckage of what she had done. The magnitude of her crime was too vast to process. Panic might have given way to numbness. Yet rather than seeking help or confessing, she began to think of survival, how to conceal what she had done, how to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Her first step was to hide the bodies. In the dim light of that night, she dragged her father's lifeless form to a part of the house where she constructed a crude, makeshift tomb, a space sealed off to keep him out of sight and mind. Her mother's remains she placed in a wardrobe, wrapped and concealed with care born not of compassion, but of fear. With the evidence hidden, Virginia set about transforming her home from a crime scene into a deception. Days turned to weeks and weeks into months. The smell of decay must have hung in the air, yet Virginia continued to live among the remains as if nothing had happened. She avoided visitors, made excuses for why her parents were never home, and slowly began crafting a web of lies to protect herself. She told neighbors her parents had moved away, that they were ill or staying with relatives. Sometimes she claimed they were traveling. Every lie was carefully designed to buy her more time. And with each passing day, the horrifying truth grew more deeply buried beneath her carefully maintained act. Outside, the world went on unaware. To the community, the McCulloughs had simply vanished quietly from village life, an elderly couple enjoying retirement elsewhere, perhaps. But inside the house on Pump Hill, Virginia McCullough was living a nightmare of her own creation, surrounded by the physical evidence of her betrayal, sustained only by deceit and denial. What had started as desperation had turned into an existence defined by secrets, silence, and the lingering presence of death. And as the months passed, her web of lies would only grow more elaborate, leading her deeper into a darkness from which there would be no return. By late 2019, the McCullough home on Pump Hill had become a mausoleum disguised as an ordinary suburban residence. The curtains remained drawn most days, the garden grew untended, and the usual signs of a retired couple's life, the laughter of visitors, the smell of Sunday roasts, the chatter with neighbors, had all vanished. Only Virginia remained, moving quietly through the rooms where her parents had once lived, surrounded by the traces of their existence. The silence inside the house was suffocating, yet she maintained her facade with astonishing precision. To the outside world, she appeared calm, even ordinary, crafting lies with practiced ease to protect her secret. Every interaction became a performance, Every question from neighbors a test of her composure. In the months that followed the murders, Virginia's lies began to take shape as a second life. When family members called to ask about her parents, she claimed they were unwell and preferred privacy. To others, she said they had decided to retire quietly to another part of the country. Sometimes she hinted that they were traveling or living abroad. The stories changed slightly depending on the audience, but her tone never wavered. She even went so far as to forge letters and emails, posing as her parents to assure distant relatives that everything was fine. The deception was meticulous and sustained, an act of manipulation designed to buy her time and cover the ongoing crime. Behind that calm exterior, however, Virginia was living in a state of quiet paranoia. Every knock at the door sent a jolt of panic through her body. Every unexpected letter, phone call, or visit from officials triggered a fear that her secret might finally be uncovered. Yet she adapted, turning each challenge into another lie. When pension authorities inquired about her parents' status, she claimed they were alive but unable to handle their finances. She managed to continue accessing their bank accounts, collecting their pension money for years after their deaths. The financial gain was small compared to the enormity of her crimes, but it was enough to sustain her existence. Groceries, bills, and the basic costs of living. Neighbors who had once seen John and Lois tending the front garden or walking to the local shop began to notice their absence. One neighbor, an elderly woman who had known Lois for years, later told investigators that she found it odd how quickly the couple had disappeared without a word of farewell. Virginia, when asked, smiled politely and offered vague explanations. They're staying with friends, Mom's not well, Dad's helping out family up north. The lies were believable enough for a time. After all, the McCulloughs were elderly, and people assumed they had simply chosen to live quietly elsewhere. As the months turned into years, Virginia became more reclusive. Her social circle shrank until it consisted only of distant acquaintances. The house itself decayed quietly. Paint began to peel, the garden grew wild, and the once orderly rooms took on a stale, forgotten air. Inside, the hidden remains of John and Lois lay undisturbed, their presence haunting every corner of the home. It was said that Virginia continued to talk about them as if they were still alive, describing their plans or health updates with casual detachment. It was a pattern of self-delusion, perhaps a coping mechanism, perhaps an extension of her deceit. The boundaries between her lies and her reality began to blur. Investigators would later theorize that Virginia's mental state deteriorated during those years. Isolated, surrounded by the reminders of her crimes, she sank deeper into denial. Psychologists who analyzed the case after her arrest described her behavior as compartmentalized psychosis, where a person maintains a dual existence, one based on truth and one built entirely on lies. She had killed her parents, hidden their bodies, and yet somehow convinced herself she could go on living as though nothing had changed. In that sense, the house became both her prison and her sanctuary, the one place where her version of reality still held power. Family members, however, began to grow uneasy. One of Virginia's siblings, who lived elsewhere in the UK, had grown suspicious over the years due to the lack of direct contact with their parents. Text messages and emails supposedly from John or Lois began to feel unnatural, the tone slightly off, the phrasing uncharacteristic. Attempts to arrange video calls or visits were always met with excuses. Virginia claimed they were too tired, too ill, or simply not up for company. Eventually, communication became so strained that relatives started to suspect something was seriously wrong. But even then, few could have imagined the truth, that both parents had been dead for years, concealed in their own home by their daughter. By 2021, the financial deception began to draw quiet attention. Automated systems occasionally flagged inconsistencies in pension activity, but the irregularities were small enough to escape deeper scrutiny. Virginia, skilled at fabricating correspondence, managed to keep the illusion intact. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Social services made inquiries, neighbors whispered, and distant relatives began to question why the McCulloughs had seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. In her isolation, Virginia's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She was seen less often in public, her appearance more disheveled, her manner distant and distracted. People described her as pale and nervous, avoiding eye contact, often muttering to herself when leaving the house. Some thought she was grieving, assuming her parents had passed away naturally and privately. Others believed she was caring for them in secret. The truth, of course, was far darker than anyone dared imagine. What made the case particularly disturbing was how long the lie endured. For years passed before anyone forced the issue. In early 2023, a relative, unable to shake growing suspicions, contacted the police to request a welfare check on John and Lois. The family had not heard their voices or seen them in person since 2019. Officers visited the McCullough residence in Great Bad Dow to make inquiries. Virginia greeted them with composure, insisting her parents were fine but away from home. Her demeanor was calm, even polite, but as officers looked around, something about the house felt wrong. The stale air, the heavy atmosphere, the faint odor of decay that lingered despite her explanations. Police soon obtained a warrant to search the property more thoroughly. It was then, after 4 long years of deception, that the grim truth began to surface. Hidden within the house, in concealed spaces and sealed compartments, officers discovered the remains of John and Lois McCullough. Their bodies had been carefully hidden, wrapped and contained, but the passage of time had betrayed Virginia's efforts. Forensic teams moved cautiously through the home, documenting every detail, every trace of evidence that spoke of what had transpired there. News of the discovery spread rapidly across Great Bad Dow. The quiet village that had once seen the McCulloughs as model neighbors was now at the center of one of Essex's most horrifying domestic murder cases. Reporters gathered near the property, and shocked locals spoke in disbelief. They remembered John's gentle smile, Lois's warmth, and the seemingly ordinary daughter who had lived among them all this time. No one could comprehend how such brutality had unfolded behind the walls of an unassuming family home. As police escorted Virginia McCullough from the property, she appeared calm, almost detached. There were no tears, no protestations of innocence, just a hollow stillness that unsettled even the officers handling her arrest. The truth that had been buried for years was finally in the open. The facade had crumbled, and the woman who had once been simply the daughter next door was now facing the world as a double murderer. Her crimes born not of sudden rage, but of years of resentment, delusion, and deceit. The investigation that followed would expose every hidden layer of her deception and reveal the psychological darkness that had consumed her long before she ever raised her hand against her parents. The discovery inside the McCullough home marked the end of Virginia's long illusion and the beginning of one of Essex's most haunting murder investigations. As forensic teams sealed off the modest property on Pump Hill, the once quiet neighborhood became a scene of flashing blue lights, crime scene tents, and hushed speculation. Officers in protective suits moved in and out, carrying evidence bags and recording every fragment of a life that had been built on lies. The stench of decomposition, the sealed compartments, the layers of concealment. All of it told the story of a crime that had been carefully hidden but never truly forgotten by the house itself. Within hours of the discovery, Virginia McCullough was taken into custody. Her calmness during arrest unsettled even seasoned detectives. She did not fight or cry. She merely watched as the home she had lived in for years was swarmed by investigators. During her initial interviews, she spoke in a quiet, almost distant tone, offering fragmented explanations rather than outright denials. She admitted that her parents were dead, but her descriptions of the events that led to their deaths shifted between self-pity and confusion. Detectives described her as emotionally flat, someone who seemed disconnected from the reality of what she had done. It was this eerie composure that convinced officers they were dealing not only with a murderer, but with a deeply disturbed woman whose perception of reality had long since fractured. The forensic investigation painted a grim picture of the years that had followed the killings. Both John and Lois had died in June 2019, and their remains showed evidence of the methods Virginia had used. Toxicology confirmed traces of prescription drugs in their systems, consistent with poisoning. The cause of death for Lois was determined to be a combination of blunt and sharp force injuries, clear evidence of a violent assault. Investigators discovered that Virginia had attempted to clean and seal parts of the house to contain the smell, using makeshift barriers and chemical sprays. Her father's body had been hidden in a constructed cavity behind a section of the house, described by police as a homemade tomb. Her mother's remains were found in an upstairs wardrobe, wrapped carefully, as though she had tried to both conceal and preserve them. It was an act that blurred the line between denial and delusion, a grim effort to erase her crime while living with it every day. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they uncovered years of deception extending far beyond the murders themselves. Virginia had accessed her parents' pension accounts, forged documents, and impersonated them in communications. She sent emails pretending to be her father, made phone calls in her mother's name, and even wrote holiday cards to relatives in their handwriting. It was a web of deceit so elaborate that it fooled government systems and family members alike for nearly 4 years. But the truth was that Virginia's lies had never been sophisticated. They had simply gone unchallenged because no one could imagine the alternative. Few people would believe that a daughter could live for years alongside the corpses of her parents, sustaining herself on their money and lies. The news spread rapidly across Britain, picked up by every major outlet. The story of a daughter killing her elderly parents and hiding their bodies in their family home horrified readers and viewers. Commentators called it a house of silence, a suburban nightmare concealed behind neat hedges and lace curtains. Reporters interviewed neighbors who expressed shock and guilt for never suspecting a thing. "They were such a nice couple," one neighbor said softly. "And Virginia, she was quiet but polite. You'd never think she was living like that." The tragedy shattered the illusion of safety that small communities often cling to, the belief that evil can be seen, predicted, or avoided. In court, the atmosphere was heavy with disbelief. When Virginia McCullough appeared before the judge at Chelmsford Crown Court, she looked far removed from the image of a cold-blooded killer. She wore simple clothing, her hair unkempt, her eyes vacant. She spoke softly, barely audible at times. The prosecution outlined the chilling facts: how she poisoned her parents, how she finished the job with violence, and how she then constructed an elaborate cover-up to steal their money and live in the same home for years. The defense did not contest the killings but focused on her mental health, describing her as a woman who had suffered years of emotional decline, isolation, and psychological instability. Experts testified that she showed signs of dissociation and long-term depression, which had distorted her judgment and moral awareness. The courtroom heard how Virginia had once been a promising young woman, intelligent and articulate, but had drifted into dependence after years of failed relationships, financial hardship, and emotional turmoil. Her parents had tried to help her repeatedly, taking her back into their home despite growing tension. The prosecution, however, argued that her actions went far beyond any mental breakdown, that she had acted with deliberate calculation, first by poisoning, then by staging the concealment, and finally by maintaining a deception for profit. It was not an impulsive crime, they said, but one of long-term selfishness and deceit. Witnesses from the family described the heartbreak of realizing how completely they had been deceived. Siblings spoke of confusion and guilt, of the text messages they had believed, the excuses they had accepted. "We trusted her," one relative said through tears. "We thought Mom and Dad were happy somewhere quiet. We never imagined they were already gone." The prosecutor's closing remarks captured the mood of the entire trial. This was not only the murder of 2 parents, but the burial of truth itself. For 4 years, Virginia McCullough lived among lies, choosing deceit over confession, theft over remorse, and silence over the dignity her parents deserved. When the verdict came, it brought both closure and sorrow. Virginia McCullough was found guilty of the murders of John and Lois McCullough. The judge described her actions as a sustained and shocking betrayal of parental love. During sentencing, the courtroom fell silent as the judge recounted how she had killed, concealed, and deceived for years without a flicker of conscience. He noted that while her mental health may have played a role, it did not erase her responsibility for the deliberate and cruel acts she had committed. Virginia was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term that ensured she would spend decades behind bars. In the aftermath, Great Bad Dow struggled to come to terms with what had happened in its midst. The McCullough home remained cordoned off for months before being cleared and sold. Locals avoided passing the property, describing an eerie quiet that lingered long after the police had left. For many, it became a symbol of hidden tragedy, a reminder that even the most ordinary streets can hold unimaginable secrets. Psychologists and criminologists later studied the case as a rare example of prolonged domestic homicide concealment, a combination of mental illness, dependency, and deception that had allowed the crime to remain undiscovered for so long. They debated whether Virginia's actions were driven more by desperation or by moral collapse, but all agreed on one thing. It was a case that defied simple explanation. In the end, the story of John and Lois McCullough was not just about murder, but about the corrosion of trust and the slow disintegration of a family that once seemed unbreakable. Their lives had been built on love, patience, and faith in their daughter, qualities that Virginia exploited and ultimately destroyed. And as she now spends her days behind the walls of a prison cell, the echoes of that quiet house in Great Baddow linger, a place where love turned to betrayal, and where silence became the keeper of a terrible truth for long years. In the quiet halls of a Virginia senior home, an 81-year-old woman's final moments revealed a chilling truth. Her killers weren't strangers, but her own daughter and grandson. What drove a family to turn deadly? This haunting case of love, delusion, and betrayal will grip you until the very end. The summer air in Norfolk, Virginia, was thick and humid, clinging to the walls of the Commonwealth Senior Living Facility as dusk settled over the quiet neighborhood. Inside, 81-year-old Cleo Loisides prepared for bed like she did every night, soft music playing on her bedside radio, her favorite lavender blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and a framed photograph of her daughter and grandson resting on the nightstand. The staff adored her. She was polite, independent, and still carried herself with the grace of a woman who had once modeled in her youth. But beneath the calm rhythm of her routine, fate was quietly closing in. Earlier that day, Cleo received visitors, her daughter, Heather Cummings, and grandson, Clifton. To staff members, it looked like a warm family reunion. Heather, 53, had driven down from Indiana. A long trip, she explained, was to spend some time with Mom. Clifton, just 24, followed closely, appearing quiet and withdrawn. They brought flowers and a small bag of clothes for Cleo, smiling politely at the receptionist as they signed the visitor log. No one suspected anything sinister. Families came and went from the facility all the time, often emotional, sometimes grieving, but always wrapped in the universal tenderness of love for their elders. What no one saw that evening was the dark intent buried beneath their smiles. Cleo was frail but far from helpless. Though she relied on the nursing staff for assistance, she still managed to keep her dignity intact. She was proud, well-dressed, and known for her soft-spoken kindness. But the relationship with her daughter had long been complicated. Years of emotional distance and quiet resentment had simmered between them, born from old family disputes, financial strain, and feelings of neglect. Heather had once been close to her mother, but something had changed over time, a sense of bitterness that hardened into quiet hostility. Investigators would later piece together that this wasn't a spontaneous act. Heather and Clifton hadn't just stopped by on a whim. They had planned this visit carefully. Phone records showed messages between the two in the weeks before the trip, their words coded but unmistakable in meaning. Heather spoke of ending things and helping Mom move on. At first glance, it could have meant relocating Cleo to another home or managing her estate. But detectives would later understand that ending things was something much darker. That night, just before midnight, the hallways of the senior facility were silent except for the distant hum of an air conditioner. Staff had already completed their rounds. Heather and Clifton were still in Cleo's room, long past visiting hours. A nurse later recalled hearing muffled voices, maybe an argument, followed by what she thought was a soft thump. She didn't investigate. It wasn't unusual for residents to drop something or shift in bed. But in that brief window of quiet, something irreversible happened. According to Heather's later confession, she had been sitting at her mother's bedside, trying to talk her into letting go, The conversation became emotional. Cleo resisted, confused and frightened by her daughter's words. She had no idea that the gentle hand on her arm was about to turn violent. Heather's voice trembled as she allegedly whispered, "It's for the best, Mom." Then Clifton stepped forward, holding the strap of a bag they had brought with them. What followed was chaos. Cleo's desperate struggle, Heather holding her down, and Clifton tightening the strap around her neck until her frail body went still. The act took less than 2 minutes, but it would destroy 3 generations of a family. When it was over, the room fell silent again. Clifton stood frozen, trembling, while Heather wept quietly beside the bed. Cleo lay motionless, her features soft and peaceful, as though she had simply fallen asleep. Heather later told police she kissed her mother's forehead before they left the room. They walked out calmly, exited through the front lobby, and drove off into the night. The staff on duty had no idea what had just occurred. Cleo's door was closed, her lights dimmed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The following morning, a caretaker making routine rounds opened Cleo's door and immediately sensed something was wrong. Cleo was unresponsive, her skin pale, her body unnaturally still. Staff called emergency services, hoping for a miracle, but it was too late. Paramedics declared her dead at the scene. At first, the death was assumed to be natural. After all, she was elderly, and there were no signs of forced entry or theft. Her daughter had visited, yes, but that was normal. It wasn't until the autopsy results came back days later that the truth began to unfold. The medical examiner's report was chilling. The bruising around Cleo's neck, the broken cartilage, the telltale pressure marks, all pointed to one conclusion. She had been strangled. Her death was ruled a homicide. Norfolk police immediately reopened the case, this time with a sense of urgency. Investigators began pulling visitor logs, checking surveillance footage, and interviewing staff. When they reviewed security video from the night before, the pattern was unmistakable. Heather and Clifton had been the last to see Cleo alive. Detectives tracked Heather and Clifton to Indiana, where they were arrested days later. During questioning, both initially denied involvement. Heather wept as she told detectives she would never hurt her mother. But when confronted with forensic evidence and inconsistencies in their statements, their composure cracked. The confession came in fragments, first from Clifton, who described holding the strap, then from Heather, who admitted she had helped restrain her mother. What had started as a visit of supposed love had ended in a premeditated act of murder. For investigators, it was one of the most unsettling cases they had seen. The absence of greed, the lack of rage, the calm calculation. It made the crime even harder to comprehend. Why would a daughter and grandson kill the woman who had once cared for them both? What could possibly justify such an act of betrayal? Detectives described the case as a tragedy of twisted love, where the killers seemed to believe they were delivering mercy rather than death. But the reality was stark. Cleo Loizides had not asked to die. She had been robbed of her final years by those who should have protected her. As news of the murder broke, the Norfolk community was stunned. The residents of Commonwealth Senior Living were shaken, their sense of safety shattered. Friends and former neighbors spoke of Cleo's elegance, her quiet humor, and the sadness that had shadowed her in recent years. Her death became more than a local story. It became a haunting reminder of how easily trust can be betrayed within the walls of family. The investigation had only begun, but already the foundation of the case was set. 2 generations, mother and son, had turned against the family matriarch, ending her life in a moment of distorted conviction. What led them to that point, what darkness festered between them, would soon come to light in the next chapter of this devastating story. When the confessions were transcribed and the recordings sealed as evidence, the case of Cleo Loizides shifted from a mystery to a disturbing exploration of motive. Detectives had solved the who and the how, but the why lingered like a ghost over every interview, every file, and every sleepless night in the Norfolk Police Department. The story that emerged over the following weeks painted a portrait of a family unraveling under years of tension, resentment, and psychological decay. A slow collapse that ended in tragedy. Heather Cummings had not always been a suspect in her mother's eyes. Decades earlier, she had been Cleo's only daughter, the child Cleo adored and protected fiercely. But as Heather entered adulthood, the closeness faded. Friends described Heather as a woman who lived in her mother's shadow, struggling with insecurity and a constant need for validation. Cleo had lived an accomplished life, former model, banker, and theater volunteer. She was poised and well-respected, while Heather, by contrast, seemed to drift from one disappointment to another. Financial instability, failed relationships, and health problems created a growing sense of bitterness. At family gatherings, subtle tension often hung in the air. What began as quiet disagreements over money or care responsibilities for Cleo's later years slowly turned into open resentment. By the time Heather's own son, Clifton, reached adulthood, he had become the center of her world. Friends and neighbors in Indiana described them as inseparable, a bond that seemed more like dependency than love. Heather relied on Clifton for emotional support, often venting to him about her frustrations with life, her finances, and her mother. The conversations became darker over time. She told him Cleo was ready to go, that she was tired of suffering, even though Cleo's health records showed she was stable. In reality, Cleo had adjusted to her senior living facility quite well, often participating in group activities and calling her daughter weekly. But Heather's perception of her mother's condition seemed twisted, colored by her own guilt and exhaustion. Psychologists later called it a form of projected despair. Heather may have seen her mother's aging as a reflection of her own failures, her own helplessness. Instead of facing that pain, she convinced herself that ending Cleo's life was an act of mercy. Clifton, young and impressionable, absorbed his mother's words without question. The idea grew between them like a secret pact, spoken softly at first, then concretely discussed in the weeks before the murder. The drive from Indiana to Virginia wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. Police recovered text messages that revealed travel coordination, talk of timing, and chillingly casual remarks about doing it gently. When Heather and Clifton stood before the magistrate after their arrest, the courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the clicking of handcuffs. Reporters filled the benches, their pens ready to record the first words from the accused. Heather appeared pale, wearing a wrinkled gray sweatshirt, her eyes hollow from days in custody. Clifton, barely more than a boy, looked lost, glancing toward his mother as though seeking direction even now. They spoke only to confirm their names. The charges, second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, were read aloud in monotone. When the judge denied bond, Heather closed her eyes as if she already knew the outcome. In the days that followed, police interviews, witness statements, and psychological assessments began to reveal more about their mental states. Clifton's defense attorney requested a competency evaluation, arguing that his client's emotional maturity had been shaped by years of psychological manipulation from his mother. There was evidence to support it. Friends said Clifton rarely made decisions without consulting Heather, even for simple things like buying groceries. He had grown up under her influence, isolated from extended family, and fed a narrative that Cleo was suffering and wanted peace. Detectives interviewed staff at the senior facility, who recalled nothing unusual about Heather and Clifton's visit. They had arrived in the late afternoon, stayed through dinner, and were polite to everyone. Cleo had seemed happy to see them. She even told a nurse that she was grateful her daughter had come such a long way. No one could have predicted that within hours, that same daughter would take her life. The staff's shock turned into grief, and grief into guilt. One nurse told local media, her voice trembling, "I keep thinking, what if I had checked the room earlier? What if I had knocked again?" But guilt could not undo what had already been done. Meanwhile, back in Indiana, neighbors who had known Heather for years struggled to process the news. They remembered her as a private woman, devoted to her son but often overwhelmed. Some recalled odd comments she had made in the months before the killing, mentions of preparing for something or finally finding peace. Most dismissed it as emotional talk. No one imagined she was planning a murder. Cleo's funeral was held quietly, attended by a few close friends and members of the Norfolk community. Many of them couldn't bring themselves to speak about the circumstances of her death. They remembered her as a dignified woman, with kind eyes and a soft laugh. A small table at the front of the church displayed her old photographs. Cleo in her 20s, posing elegantly in a vintage dress. Cleo in her 40s, holding Heather as a baby. The images felt like fragments from another world, one untouched by the violence that would later define their family name. As investigators dug deeper into the psychological motives, the narrative became increasingly complex. Was this murder born of cruelty, or was it the result of delusion? Heather told detectives she believed her mother wanted to be free, insisting Cleo had spoken about death many times. But there was no record or testimony to support that. In fact, friends described Cleo as someone who loved life, despite her age. She was planning to attend a theater event the following week and had even mentioned wanting to see Clifton pursue his own future. The disconnection between Heather's version and reality was staggering. Prosecutors began preparing for a case that would likely hinge on mental health and intent. The evidence of premeditation was strong, the travel, the planning, the confessions. Yet, there was an undeniable undercurrent of psychological disturbance running through both suspects. Experts began to describe Heather's mindset as a shared psychosis, where her distorted beliefs transferred to her son. Together, they formed a closed loop of delusion, convincing each other that their act was one of love rather than murder. Outside the courthouse, the story spread quickly across social media and national outlets. Headlines called it the Norfolk family killing, the senior home strangling, or more simply, the Cleo case. For a time, the tragedy consumed public attention. Talk shows debated elder abuse, mental illness, and family violence. Comment sections filled with outrage, some condemning Heather and Clifton as monsters, others pitying them as broken souls. But amid the noise, one truth stood firm. An elderly woman who deserved peace in her final years had been robbed of it by the very people she trusted most. For investigators, the Loyzides case became a symbol of the hidden darkness that can dwell within families. It was not a story of greed or passion, but of misguided love, desperation, and psychological collapse. As court proceedings moved forward, the evidence grew stronger, the details clearer, but the emotional weight of the crime never lifted. Detectives who worked the case would later describe it as one that haunted them, a reminder that sometimes, the danger that destroys a life doesn't come from strangers lurking outside, but from the people who say they love you most. And as the trial approached, with Heather and Clifton sitting behind bars awaiting judgment, one question remained unanswered. Was this murder born from malice, or a delusion so deep it blurred the line between mercy and madness? The truth, as it would soon emerge, would be even darker than anyone expected. As autumn settled over Norfolk, the courthouse became the stage for the final act in the story that had gripped the city for months. The case of Cleo Loyzides was no longer just a police investigation. It had become a national conversation about mental illness, family loyalty, and the fragile boundary between care and control. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Journalists filled the benches, their notepads ready, while members of the community sat in silence, waiting to see how justice would interpret one of the most unsettling family murders Virginia had seen in years. Heather and Clifton Cummings entered separately, escorted by deputies. Both wore the beige uniforms of the Norfolk City Jail. Their faces told the story of months spent behind bars. Clifton's youthful features dulled by anxiety, Heather's once defiant gaze replaced by exhaustion. The prosecution opened with the simple, chilling facts. They described how the two had traveled from Indiana to Virginia with a shared purpose, how they entered the senior facility that night under the guise of family affection, and how they left behind a lifeless mother and grandmother. The evidence was undeniable. Surveillance footage, phone records, and their own taped confessions. But the defense tried to paint a more complex picture. They didn't deny what happened, they couldn't. Instead, they argued intent. Heather's attorney described her as a woman unraveling, driven by the belief that her mother was suffering. They claimed she wasn't motivated by hatred or greed, but by delusion, an emotional collapse that blurred her sense of right and wrong. Clifton's defense focused on manipulation, portraying him as a young man coerced into an unthinkable act by the mother he trusted completely. The legal strategy was clear: not to exonerate them, but to explain them. The courtroom listened as mental health experts took the stand. One psychologist testified that Heather showed signs of shared psychotic disorder, a rare condition in which one person's delusional beliefs dominate another's mind. According to her, Heather's obsession with her mother's mortality had become a self-created reality, and Clifton had simply absorbed that distorted truth. Another expert countered that while mental illness might have played a role, it didn't erase accountability. They planned, traveled, and executed a killing. They understood the permanence of death, even if they misjudged its morality. The prosecution displayed the physical evidence in methodical detail. The strap used in the strangulation, the visitor log signed by Heather's careful hand, the time-stamped footage showing the pair leaving the facility calmly after the murder. Each piece of evidence felt like a quiet dagger to the spectators who had once believed in the sanctity of family bonds. When Cleo's autopsy photographs were shown, her bruised neck, her frail body marked by the violence of her final moments, the courtroom fell silent. Even Heather looked away, tears slipping down her face as she muttered something under her breath. Among the witnesses was a nurse who had known Cleo personally. Her voice trembled as she described Cleo's gentle nature, her kindness to staff, and her excitement over the visit from her daughter and grandson. "She said she was happy that night," the nurse whispered. "She said it made her feel young again." Those words hung in the air like a curse, turning what should have been a tender family reunion into a portrait of betrayal. During cross-examination, Heather broke down. Her voice cracked as she tried to justify her actions. "She wanted peace," she repeated, as if convincing herself. But prosecutors pressed her on every inconsistency. Why there was no suicide note, no doctor's report of suffering, no request from Cleo herself to end her life. Heather had no answers. The jury watched closely as her composure crumbled, revealing the hollow confusion beneath her defiance. Clifton remained mostly silent, eyes downcast, hands trembling whenever his name was mentioned. Outside the courtroom, the media dissected every detail. Opinion pieces debated whether the case symbolized elder abuse or mental illness. Some argued that Heather's delusions made her a patient as much as a perpetrator. Others saw no room for sympathy. A mother and son had plotted and killed a defenseless woman. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse with signs reading "Justice for Cleo." For them, it wasn't about psychology or despair. It was about the sanctity of life and the horror of betrayal. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. The prosecution's final words were sharp and haunting. "This was not mercy," the attorney said, voice rising with conviction. "This was murder. A woman who loved her family was held down and strangled by them. The motive was not compassion. It was control, fear, and delusion." The defense countered with a plea for understanding, describing Heather as a broken soul who believed she was ending pain, and Clifton as a lost child following his mother's orders. "If this is justice," her lawyer said, "let it be tempered with mercy." When the jury retreated for deliberation, the room emptied into a tense silence. Hours passed, marked only by the occasional shuffle of deputies and the hum of air vents. Finally, just after sunset, the jury returned. Everyone stood as the foreperson delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Heather wept openly, her hands shaking as deputies moved to escort her away. Clifton didn't cry. He simply stared at the floor, as if he had expected nothing less. The judge sentenced both to lengthy prison terms, the years stretching far beyond what remained of their natural lives. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of what had transpired settled in. There were no victors in the case of Cleo Loizides, only the echo of loss. Cleo's friends and neighbors left quietly, clutching tissues and photographs. A few whispered that justice had been done, but even that felt hollow. The verdict could not erase the image of a frail woman dying alone, nor could it mend the fracture that had split 3 generations of one family. In the months that followed, the story faded from national headlines but remained alive in the local memory of Norfolk. Residents of the senior facility struggled to move on, though some said they still avoided walking past Cleo's old room at night. The staff installed new security measures, stricter visitor hours, and additional cameras, but those were only surface changes. What lingered deeper was the unease that evil could wear a familiar face. Inside prison walls, Heather reportedly kept to herself, attending counseling sessions and writing letters that were never mailed. Clifton was placed under psychiatric observation, spending his days in quiet isolation. When journalists attempted to reach them, both declined to comment. Their silence only deepened the mystery of their bond, the mother and son whose love had become deadly. For those who knew Cleo, memories of her life became a way to reclaim her story from the horror of her death. A small theater group she once volunteered with held a memorial performance in her honor, dedicating a night to the woman who loved the arts and laughter. Her photograph, smiling, graceful, unbroken, hung at the front of the stage. To them, that was the Cleo they chose to remember. In the end, the murder of Cleo Loizides was not just another headline or court case. It was a window into the silent tragedies that can grow unnoticed within families. It showed how love, when twisted by obsession and despair, can lose its humanity. The story began as a quiet evening in a senior home and ended as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the hidden depths of human darkness. As the final files were archived and the case closed, one detective summed it up in his report. This was not a story of monsters, but of people who lost their way, and in losing themselves, they took an innocent life. The words echoed the sentiment that haunted everyone who touched the case, that the line between devotion and destruction can be as thin and as deadly as a strap drawn tight in the stillness of a night meant for love.